The scream fractured the midnight hush as Emma Reed clutched Liam and felt the world tilt. Jason Cole snarled from the threshold, and the door shuddered on its hinges. The sirens outside throbbed like a warning. The narrator says the room held its breath as glass glinted on the counter. Emma said, "You don't get to scare him again." Jason said, "You made this mess." The latch slammed, and the hallway swallowed him. The narrator says fear pressed its thumbprint into every surface. Liam said, "Are we safe, Mom?" Emma steadied her breath and pulled him close. The narrator says, rain stitched light across the window like cold thread. Emma said, "I've got you." The sirens faded, leaving heartbeat and hush. The narrator says the night sealed a promise and a wound. Emma stared at the door, thinking of courts and bills and the truth. The narrator says a storm had stepped inside and would not leave. The narrator says dawn crept in thin and gray, finding two figures folded into a couch fortress. Emma traced the seam of a bill and swallowed the taste of metal. Maya called once, and the phone vibrated like a hesitant knock. Emma said later. The kettle clicked alive, and the small sound felt brave. Liam said, "Can we stay home?" The narrator says the answer was a knot she could not untie. Emma said, "We'll make pancakes and talk." The rain eased to a whisper and left the city rinsed and bare. The narrator says the apartment smelled of steam and dust and a new plan. Emma stacked envelopes like dominoes she refused to topple. The narrator says memory tried to rewrite the night, but the door's echoes stayed. Emma said, "We start with breakfast and honesty." The narrator says morning held its breath, waiting to see if she would. The narrator says the pan hissed and memory rose like smoke. Nights of double shifts had carved quiet roads in Emma's mind. She counted tips by moonlight and stitched holes in hope. Liam said, "You always fix things." Emma smiled, and her hands shook only a little. The narrator says bills had names back then: rent, heat, medicine, and each asked for blood. Emma said, "We got through because we stayed kind." The clock ticked like a metronome for courage. The narrator says fatigue once taught her to speak softly, so fear would not wake him. Emma flipped a pancake and watched it rise. The narrator says she was tired of surviving in whispers. Emma said, "Today we make noise that matters." The light pushed deeper into the room and found her steadier. The narrator says the doorbell cut through their small calm. An envelope slid under the door like a blade. Emma said, "Eat while it's warm." She picked it up and felt the weight of ink. The seal read Family Court, and her breath shortened. Liam said, "Is it from him?" The narrator says, the room tilted but did not fall. Emma placed the letter flat and kept her voice level. Emma said, "It's paperwork, and we will handle it." The kettle sighed again, like a friend repeating advice. The narrator says fear rearranged the furniture and then left. Emma set 2 plates and decided which truth to tell first. The narrator says the day had shifted, but her footing had not. The narrator says Emma opened the blinds and let the city in. She folded the envelope into a stack she would face after breakfast. Maya texted, and the screen glowed with a promise to come by. Emma said, "We're not running anymore." Liam said, "Do we need armor?" She laughed, and the sound surprised her. The narrator says the laugh cleared dust from corners. Emma said, "We need truth and notes and a steady voice." The skillet cooled like a small moon. The narrator says she pictured a courtroom and a chair that would hold her steady. Emma tucked a curl behind her ear and breathed from the soles of her feet. The narrator says resolve found a home and locked a door from inside. Emma sat at her desk as the clock neared 8, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The narrator says her office smelled of burnt coffee and fluorescent hums. "Ah." The manager said, "We can't afford distractions." Emma said, "I haven't missed a deadline." Yet whispers carried through cubicles and papers shuffled like accusations. The narrator says she felt her job trembling under her feet. Emails stacked like bricks on her screen, and Jason's name appeared in one, sent by legal counsel. Emma's chest tightened. The manager said, "Clients can't see chaos." The narrator says she swallowed hard and pushed through keystrokes. Emma said, "You'll get results." But the air felt brittle, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see if she cracked. The narrator says later that evening, Maya dropped by with 2 paper cups and an armful of energy. Maya said, "You look like a ghost." Emma said, "Work is slipping through my hands." The steam curled up between them like fragile hope. Maya said, "I've got you always." But the narrator says Emma noticed her friend avoiding her eyes, phone buzzing in her pocket. Emma said, "You can tell me anything." Maya forced a smile, her words thin as tissue. The narrator says Emma's heart wanted to believe, but shadows stretched long between sips of coffee. The narrator says the next morning, the envelope lay heavy on the table. Emma tore it open with steady hands that betrayed their tremor. Inside, custody petition lines burned into her eyes. Emma said, "He's going for full custody." Liam peeked from the hallway, small voice cutting air. Liam said, "Does that mean I leave?" Emma pulled him close, whispering with a throat raw from fear. Emma said, "No, you stay with me." The narrator says the ink on the paper threatened everything she had built, but her arms around Liam steadied her pulse. The narrator says memory clawed at Emma as she lay awake. The night years ago, when Jason left, replayed with cruel clarity. Jason said, "You'll never manage without me." The slam echoed, and the room shrank. The narrator says she worked nights, counted tips, and held Liam while tears hid in shadows. Emma whispered to the ceiling, "I did manage." Yet the ache returned, not for him but for the life lost to his storm. The narrator says ghosts lived in the cracks of walls, but they reminded her she had survived them once. The narrator says Liam sat cross-legged on the floor with crayons scattered like confessions. He looked up, voice thin. Liam said, "Why does Dad hate us?" Emma's breath caught, but she crouched beside him. Emma said, "He doesn't hate you. He's hurting and wrong." The narrator says truth and shield tangled in her throat, but she spoke anyway. Liam leaned against her, crayon rolling away unheard. Emma kissed his hair and said, "You are my world, and nothing will take that away." The narrator says silence folded them, but inside it grew the promise of steel. Emma stepped onto the school courtyard at pickup and felt eyes tilt like mirrors. The narrator says gossip moved in low ripples, quick and hungry. Jason laughed too loud near the gate, oiled charm slick as rain. Jason said, "We all worry about stability, don't we?" A mother flinched and looked at Emma with polite doubt. The narrator says public kindness can bruise like stone. Emma said, "Liam's fine, and so am I." Jason flashed a grin that hid a knife. The narrator says rumors are scaffolds built from air, yet they hold weight. Emma knelt to meet Liam and let her voice be steady ground. Emma said, "Ready for home, champ." Jason said, "Courts like routine." The narrator says the word routine became a trap laid on concrete. Emma stood taller, gathering backpack and courage, and walked away. The narrator says evening folded around the apartment as Maya stacked takeout on the table like a peace offering. Maya said, "He is playing you in public, so play smarter." Emma said, "I'm tired of playing at all." The kettle hissed like a warning shared between friends. Maya said, "Document everything, every pickup and every message." The narrator says, "The advice felt like armor cut to size." Emma said, "I'll need help tracking it." Maya nodded, jaw set in quiet loyalty. The narrator says fear is loud, but strategy whispers with a map. Emma opened a notebook and wrote the day's small violences. Maya said, "You are not alone. Remember that." The room steadied around the scrape of a pen and the promise of a plan. The narrator says morning traffic hissed as the law office rose like a stern lighthouse. Emma sat on the edge of a chair and counted breaths. Ava Brooke said, "Custody is a story told with evidence." Emma said, I have Truth and a child who needs calm. The narrator says Truth must learn the language of paper. Ava slid a list across the desk like a compass. Ava said, keep logs, request records, save receipts. Emma nodded and felt a new spine assemble. The narrator says guidance trims panic into purpose. Emma said, I can do this. Ava said, you already are. Outside, the city kept its indifferent beat, but inside, a map unfolded. The narrator says the week gnawed at savings with small, relentless teeth. The rent reminder blinked like a metronome on her phone. Emma sorted envelopes into mountains named Now and Later. Liam said, can we still go to the museum Saturday? Emma said, we will find a day for it. The narrator says promises are bridges built of twine and faith. She sold 2 jackets online and canceled a streaming service. The narrator says sacrifice learned new shapes as the ledger tightened. Emma said, we're okay, we are building forward. The room absorbed the words like heat. The narrator says resolve paid tonight's bill, and hope saved the receipt. The narrator says midnight settled like a blanket stitched with distant sirens. Emma tucked Liam beneath a fortress of blankets and sat on the floor beside the couch. Liam said, will you be here when I wake? Emma said, always. The narrator says a promise can be a lighthouse burning on a teaspoon of oil. She wrote 3 sentences in the notebook and capped the pen like a ritual. The clock clicked forward with patient mercy. Emma said tomorrow we add 1 good thing. The narrator says small vows are bricks no storm can carry. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the couch frame, listening to Liam breathe like surf meeting shore. The narrator says, Emma reached for her phone and froze as messages spilled across the screen. Bank statements, emails, and one signed by Maya cut her breath short. Emma said, no, this can't be real. The narrator says betrayal wears the face of those you trust most. Maya had sent Jason updates about schedules, pickups, even arguments. Emma whispered, why, Maya? The kettle hissed like an answer too cruel to hear. The narrator says her chest hollowed as the walls seemed to lean closer. What now? Liam asked from the hallway. Mom, are we okay? Emma forced her voice steady and said, yes, sweetheart. But the narrator says her faith cracked like porcelain dropped from a great height. The narrator says 2 nights later a new voice entered Emma's story. Alex Carter leaned against a bookstore counter, sleeves rolled, laughter edged with kindness. Alex said, that's the last copy. You sure you want to wrestle me for it? Emma laughed softly and said, I don't wrestle, I negotiate. The narrator says his presence was a warm draft against months of chill. Emma said, my son loves these books. Alex said, then it's yours. The narrator says she had not felt the air bend gentle for years. For a heartbeat she wondered if the world was not entirely jagged. Yet memory pricked and warned, trust is a fragile bone. The narrator says the courtroom swallowed sound as Emma stood under white lights. The judge's eyes were steady, gavel like a metronome of fate. The attorney said, is Miss Reed capable of consistent care? Emma felt the air turn sharp. She said, my child has never gone hungry, never lacked love. The narrator says her voice carved air with truth sharpened by nights of sacrifice. Jason's lawyer leaned back with a smile that cut. The judge scribbled notes, and the clock ticked louder than any heartbeat. The narrator says her knees shook, but her words did not. The narrator says night wrapped Emma in memory's grip. Her mother's voice came back with startling clarity. Her mother said, strength isn't silence, it's speaking when your voice shakes. Emma sat on the couch, notebook open, candle flickering. She whispered, I wish you were here. The narrator says memory is a ghost that can still guide. Liam stirred in his sleep, murmuring, and Emma brushed his hair back. She said, I'll show him what courage looks like. The candle burned lower and shadows leaned closer, yet her heart stood taller. The narrator says morning brought silence too heavy for cartoons. Liam pushed away his cereal, eyes clouded. He said, "Do you hate Dad?" Emma's chest squeezed, but her voice stayed calm. She said, "No, I don't hate him. I just need to protect us." The narrator says her words were bridges over jagged stones. Liam leaned into her arm, seeking anchor. Emma kissed his hair and said, "You're my reason to fight." The narrator says the weight of battle bent her spine but did not break it. Sunlight crept through blinds like a promise that tomorrow might hold. The narrator says a knock came that did not belong to debt or duty. Emma opened the door to a woman holding a weathered folder and a careful smile. The woman said, "I am Margot Tellis, your mother's sister." Emma tasted silence. The narrator says history stepped out of a photograph and asked for tea. Margot said, "I should have come sooner." Emma said, "Why now?" Margot laid the folder on the table like a treaty. The narrator says grief and suspicion circled like wary cats. Liam peeked from the hallway, and Emma nodded him back to cartoons. Margot said, "I have records that could help your case." Emma's hands hovered, unsure whether to reach or retreat. The narrator says old doors creaked open, and dust glittered like tiny truths. The narrator says Margot opened the folder, and the air shifted. Invoices, emails, and a notarized letter formed a chain of cause and effect. Margot said, "Jason hid income through a contractor shell." Emma said, "You have proof." Margot nodded and slid a spreadsheet across like a lifeline. The narrator says numbers told a story sharper than rumor. Margot said, "I tracked payments that match his custody filings." Emma said, "How did you find this?" Margot breathed and said, "I watched from far away and waited for courage." The narrator says confession arrived with a map and a cost. Emma touched the pages and felt a tremor turn into direction. The narrator says help can feel like a rescue and a trap. Emma paced between window and table, heart measuring distance. Emma said, "Why did you leave when Mom got sick?" Margot's eyes lowered like blinds in a storm. Margot said, "I failed her, and I feared failing you." The narrator says, "Regret is a heavy architect." Emma looked at Liam's art on the fridge and counted the colors. Emma said, "If I take this help, we do it clean." Margot said, "No secrets, no strings." The narrator says a boundary rose where old hurt once lived. Emma sat, uncapped a pen, and began a list titled Next Steps. The narrator says the bookstore smelled of paper and rain when Alex appeared again. Alex said, "You left without your receipt and half your courage." Emma smiled despite the ache. Emma said, "Courage is on back order." Alex laughed, and then turned serious. Alex said, "I have a past due I should name." He spoke of a brief marriage that frayed under debt and pride. The narrator says honesty set the shelves humming. Emma said, "I can handle flaws, not lies." Alex said, "Then I'll keep telling the hard parts." The narrator says hope tested its footing on honest wood. The narrator says the street outside the school turned into a stage of weathered asphalt and brittle patience. Jason stepped from his car with a smirk sharpened for spectacle. Jason said, "You won't win." Emma said, "I will not lose him." He moved closer, voice low and barbed. The narrator says anger reeks of gasoline near a match. A teacher lingered by the door, eyes wide and phone ready. Jason said, "Judge will hear about your late pickups." Emma said, "And the court will see your hidden income." The words hit him like cold water. The narrator says violence leaned in, and then thought better of it. Jason backed away as Liam ran into Emma's arms, and the crowd stared cool. The narrator says the courthouse doors opened like a cavern swallowing courage. Emma stepped inside, clutching a folder thick with truth. Jason walked ahead, his lawyer at his side, confidence trailing him like cologne. Emma said, "We fight for Liam, not for pride." The marble floor echoed with gavel weight long before it struck. The narrator says every step was a negotiation with fear. Ava said, "Stay calm, trust the evidence." Emma nodded, her breath a steady drum. Jason turned, his smirk a blade sharpened for war. The narrator says the stage was set, and silence was the curtain before the storm. The narrator says testimony began like a slow burn. Jason's lawyer said, Ms. Reed cannot provide stability. Emma clenched her jaw, eyes steady. Emma said, I provide love, food, shelter, and peace. The judge scribbled without expression. The narrator says truth sometimes drowns in paperwork. Jason said, she leaves him alone too often. Emma whispered, lies built on smoke. Ava stood, voice crisp. Ava said, we present financial evidence hidden under shell companies. The courtroom murmured, and Jason stiffened. The narrator says lies crack when sunlight finds their edges. The narrator says authority shifted with each word. The social worker leaned forward and said, the child appears bonded strongly with the mother. Jason's lawyer interrupted, voice slick with doubt. Emma inhaled, spine straight. Emma said, Liam knows home when he is with me. The narrator says the court paused, listening for the heartbeat under words. The social worker added, she provides consistency. Jason hissed, she's manipulating sympathy. Emma stayed silent, strength written in restraint. The narrator says sometimes silence can echo louder than fury. The narrator says Ava tapped Emma's hand and whispered, your turn, tell them. Emma rose and faced the room. Emma said, I worked 3 jobs to keep him fed. I carried fear in silence so he could sleep in peace. The judge leaned forward, eyes softening. The narrator says words can be armor when sharpened by truth. Emma said, I am not perfect, but I am enough. Jason shook his head, but the room's weight shifted. The narrator says her voice filled spaces where doubt once lived. Liam's name hung in the air like a promise. The narrator says the final gavel had not yet fallen, but the tension coiled thick as rope. Jason's lawyer whispered, we'll regroup. Jason's eyes flickered with unease. Emma sat down, chest rising steady, Ava's hand anchoring hers. Ava said, we gave them truth, now we wait. Emma said, whatever the verdict, Liam knows I fought. The narrator says, resolve is victory long before judgment. The clock ticked louder than hearts, and every shuffle of paper felt like thunder. Emma closed her eyes and whispered, for him always. The narrator says battles end, but love does not. The narrator says the courtroom held a breath that felt like a lifetime. The judge said, this court awards primary custody to Emma Reed. Paper rustled like distant rain. Emma said, thank you. Jason stared, thunder trapped behind his eyes. The narrator says victory arrived with a cost stitched into its hem. Ava said, you did this with truth. Emma felt her knees steady on solid ground. The narrator says, justice is not a rescue, but a door finally unlocked. Jason said, this isn't over. Emma said, it is for today. The narrator says the gavel fell, and silence changed shape into mercy. The narrator says the corridor smelled of old paper and new beginnings. Atabai. Ava pressed Emma's hand and said, breathe now. Emma said, I thought I would break. The fluorescent hum softened as if listening. The narrator says courage often looks like shaking and moving anyway. Margot stepped from a bench and said, your mother would be proud. Emma nodded, a small anchor settling. The narrator says even relief can ache where fear once lived. Maya said, I am sorry for what I did. Emma said, make it right by standing with us. The narrator says restitution starts with a step forward. The narrator says evening drew its gentle line across the apartment. Liam crawled into Emma's lap with a book that smelled like hope. Liam said, are we safe now? Emma said, we are safer, and we keep choosing safe. The kettle whispered like a lullaby that learned to be brave. The narrator says home is a practice, not a place. Emma said, tomorrow we plant a window herb and name it courage. Liam laughed and traced the picture with one finger. The narrator says peace arrived in small breaths that finally matched the room. The narrator says morning opened like a clean page. Alex knocked with a paper bag and a careful grin. Alex said, 2 muffins, 1 apology for yesterday's nerves. Emma said, we learn at the speed of honesty. The sunlight made a promise on the floorboards. The narrator says, rebuilding is a slow choreography of truth. Alex said, if you want company on hard days, I can show up right. Emma said, show up like this, steady and plain. The narrator says, futures begin where vows are small and kept. The narrator says, night returned without teeth. Emma stood at the doorway to Liam's room and let gratitude settle. Emma said, we are stronger now. Liam murmured something about stars sailing straight. The narrator says her heart loosened a knot she had carried for years. Emma sat beside him and traced a quiet map of tomorrow. Emma said, we will never stop fighting for our peace. The narrator says, the window held a thin moon like a seal on a letter. Sleep gathered them, gentle and sure.